Right, continuing on with rook plus 2 pawns versus rook plus 1 pawn in the case of those pawns being disconnected and one of them passed. I've got three incredibly tough positions to look at in this video. It's very unlikely that I'm going to get every single part of the analysis right, but hopefully there'll be enough there that we can sort of glean the main ideas and get something out of it. So this is a game from 1947. It's actually between Taimanov and Averbach, and it's black to move. So, like, what's the problem in this position? I guess is the thinking. I mean, black's got their rook behind this passed pawn and simultaneously defending the G pawn. Like, why can't they just sort of march their king over to the B4 square and just that king and that pawn will between them win this rook and it's game over. And I mean, apparently after the game, Averbach was saying he was analysing this. So for example, king c4, king g6. Now, black's got a bit of a problem. One of the main dynamics in this game is that if white can win the a pawn, sort of enticing the rook down and snatch the g pawn, they're going to get in a drawn version of rook versus pawn if this black king is too far down the board, and c4 is the square where that black king would be too far down the board. So to stand any chance whatsoever of understanding any of this stuff, by the way, you really need very good knowledge of rook versus pawn. Otherwise, you're just going to be playing moves and guessing whether they're any good. I mean, I'm sort of doing that anyway, even with detailed knowledge of rook versus pawn, just to give you an idea of, how hard this is. But that's a dynamic that's going on. I mean, I suppose you don't need detailed knowledge of rook versus pawn to just know that sort of the further away from this pawn black's king is, the better it is if you can get black to, come off the defense of the g7 pawn. So king b4, what's the problem? Well, rook over to g3, and black pushes the a pawn. Now we can't take the a pawn now because the king would take it, but we can play rook back to g2, so that when the a pawn is pushed, rook takes a2, rook takes a2, king takes g7. So in the original position, Averbach actually rejected king c4 for that, on the basis of that variation. King c4, king g6, king b4, rook over to g3, a3, rook g2. But black's winning this massively. Black doesn't have to push the a pawn, and instead black can play rook c7. Now what does white do? Because they've got to try and win the g pawn and the a pawn for their rook. So king h7, rook c5 attacks white's h pawn, king back to g6. So the point of this rook c5 move is to stop white's rook being able to take the g pawn in a sec. So yeah, king b3, rook g3 check, king b2, just keep doing the checks, and there it is, rook c2. So now white can't play rook takes g7 when they'd be able to swing over to a7, change colour from green to red as they did it, and then pick up a drawn version of rook versus pawn again. But that little rook c5 check, rook c5 move there, sorry, not a check, just forcing the king back to g6 to defend the pawn. Brilliant move. I don't know if it was the only winning move. I doubt it, because there's all sorts of different things that. Well, actually, there are only two winning moves here for blacks. That's interesting, and one of them is actually to go to a different idea altogether, which I'll get around to in a sec. So yeah, pretty important move. Rook c5. Check, rook g2, rook c2, rook g5, desperately trying to get around. Check, king c1, attacks the a pawn. Rook g2 check, king h7, king b1. The king's now made contact with the a pawn, and the rook's defending the g pawn. So what does white do now? Because they remember they need to try and win both the a pawn and the g pawn for their rook. Check, rook b2. That's it. You're off the defense of the g pawn. And black's like, nope, and you've run out of checks. So that would have been a win. So a quick reminder of where we've got to. Avabaka said that he didn't play king c4 because he saw this variation and rejected it quite rightly, because that would be a draw. However, after the game, he said that he went back and found, instead of pushing the a pawn, rook c7. Okay, and that's just a win for black. We've seen that. But in this position, after black's pushed the a pawn, white doesn't have to play rook g2. They could start like a barrage of checks, which is actually going to be much more effective. For example, king c3, rook g3 check. Just keep the checks coming. King d4. Okay, this king is now not close enough that we can actually now go for that a pawn. This is a drawn version of rook versus pawn. Just not quite close enough. If the black king was on g5, white's had it. They're about to knight on h8 and lose their knight. Only one drawing move for white here, which we'll just know off by heart if we understand our rook versus pawn stuff inside out, and it's king h6. So this barrage of checks is quite annoying for black, and they don't want their king too far away from the g pawn, basically. So a winning move would be king b5. And if white just keeps the checks going, king c6, that's it, the checks have run out. But now the king's quite a long way away from the a pawn. So white would bring their rook back, push the a pawn, rook a1. And now black's got a bit of a dilemma, because their king's in a kind of no man's land. Remember, both c4 and d4 are squares that if the black king's on, we can just take the a pawn. We can deflect the rook off the defense of g7 and get a drawn version of rook versus pawn. So this series of checks from the side by white, if the black king comes down, the checks sort of carry on, or if the black king comes across to the rook, we just nab the pawn because the black king's just too far away, as we've seen in one of those lines. I think it was king d4. There was a rook takes a3, I think, going on there, wasn't there? So yeah, the black's gone up the board with their king, but in doing so, they've sort of stuck their king too far away from the a pawn. And now where do they go? Right, king c5. White just says, all right, I'll play a waiting move. Now, at first sight, you might think that looks like a foolish waiting move. Because it's like, well, hang on a sec, there's something else going on in the position here. And white needs to be damn sure that g5 check, where obviously en passant is out of the question because you're in check. This is just drawn. The white king can chase the g pawn. Well, it's in check first of all. h6, g3, h7. The black rook's now got to go. And we covered in rook versus pawns in the case of separated pawns. If there are 4 files separating those pawns, the rook deals with them by itself. Okay. And here there are 5 files separating those pawns, so this rook will easily deal with those pawns by itself. So g5 check doesn't work, and this is very annoying for black because it means that white's got these waiting moves here. And remember, if the black king comes down too close, king c4, we'll have the pawn, and we've got a drawn version of rook versus pawn. So it's pretty clever stuff. Now, quick reminder of where we've got to so far in this position. We haven't even got to black's move yet. We're still not even close to it. So there's 2 pages of analysis on this in the Dvoretsky manual. So yeah, the idea is black thinks, right, I'll come over and just guide this pawn down to the to the a1 square, and Avabaka analyse this variation, and that's a draw, sure, but black doesn't have to push the a pawn. That rook c7 is completely won. But then white doesn't have to play rook g2. White plays rook g4 check, and it's quite a clever series of checks. Okay. If the black king comes down the board, we just keep checking, and then we'll go and nab the a pawn. Okay. If the black king goes up the board, then again we just keep checking, and when it reaches sort of far enough away from the a pawn, we can come back to g1, stick our rook on a1 as a blocker. King comes back, and our white king can hide on h7. If the black king keeps coming towards the pawn, we take on a2. If g5 check doesn't work, because we've got this. So what does black do? What's the plan? Can you think of any other winning plans? I mean, by the way, this is minus 7.8. Okay, so I keep mentioning this in some of my videos because it sort of irks me a little bit when people say things like, "Oh, it was -8. The engine said I was winning, and I was clearly winning." And it's just like, well, hang on a minute. We've got a position here where two perfectly plausible moves fail for very subtle reasons that grandmasters needed to analyse the position afterwards for ages. So what the engine says, it's like, does that mean anything? I don't think it does, but I mean, it means something in the sense that the engine says this is -8, so black's won, basically. But you've got to find the move. We're human beings, unless we're cheating and looking at the engine. We're human beings. We've got to find these moves at the board. So what do we do? Well, the winning idea is this: King d5. White's like, whatever. I'm doing these waiting moves. Can't see what you're doing here. King d6. I'm not sure that was necessary, actually. There might be just a bit of triangulation going on. I'm not sure. But I'm just looking at the engine's moves, and king e5 is fine. But king d6, king h7, king into e5. I guess we're trying to get that position with black to move. I think that's all it was. And here's black's winning plan. Go rook a6 check, drop the g pawn, and just come and collect the h pawn. Okay. If white starts pushing that pawn, they're going to get themselves checkmated. If they try and hang on to it, so they will have to be losing that pawn. So the best thing they can do is just kind of make a run for the black rook, and that's the plan. We cut the white king off on the 6th rank. We're still defending the a pawn. And I mean, it's just a sort of accounting exercise, basically. We're going to need to play one move there, and it's the red line versus the yellow line, isn't it? That's going to be going on there. Possibly even, I'm just thinking about it, whether the black king actually only needs to get to c2. And we can meet king b4 with rook disappearing back up to a8, because if we're on c2, then the white king can't come into b3. But yeah, that was the way to win it. So brilliant, basically. King c4 does win, but wow, you need to sort of go deep into the position to see why. And I'm not suggesting for a minute like that the next time I get a position like this, I'm going to be able to see all those variations over the board. That's just ridiculous. I'm just hoping that somewhere in the understanding of all of those, there's enough ideas that are going to be gleaned that maybe I'll do something sensible, and maybe some of these ideas being on my radar are things I could think about, and very good knowledge of rook versus pawn is going to be helpful. Anyway, there's more to talk about here, because Averbaka analysed king c4 and remember didn't like it, so he's decided to play rook a6 instead, cutting the white king off from the g pawn. Perfectly sensible move. King f5 played, and then black comes over, king c4. White plays rook g3. Okay. Now what black should actually do here is just drop the rook back to a7, just defend the g pawn. The white king comes into g6, king b4. We'll need to defend the a3 square because we already know about all those variations. And then when white starts the barrage of checks, we're going to get into that one plan again. I mean, I guess the fact that he hadn't seen the plan when he rejected King C4 in the first place might, we're still sort of blind to this winning plan at this stage as well. But I think it's going to be the same winning plan from there. Anyway, instead we had Rook F6 check, King to E5, and now there's only one move that wins this game, and it is basically a reversion to the winning plan already discussed. Rook F7, Rook G4 check, King back to B5, Rook G3, Rook behind the pawn, King F5, push the A pawn, King G6, A2, Rook G1, and yeah, King C4 because our G pawn is defended. In the game, Black played Rook H6, Rook G4 check, King B3, Rook G3 check, King C2, Rook G2 check, King D3, Rook G3 checks, just completely drawn now. King back to C4, Black's just like, where are we going? White just carries on with their barrage of checks. King B5, and after all that sort of good defensive work, White now sort of says, well, all right, I'll swap the G pawn for the H pawn, and then I'll just come back with my king, and that is a draw. Okay, but it was a blunder, okay? And it cost them in the game as well. Okay, so Rook takes G7 played, and Black doesn't take the H pawn. Okay, Averback just played A3. And yeah, Taimanov's had it here basically. Rook A7, that's the reason he's had it. Okay, that interference with the rook. And Rook A6. I'm just trying to, yeah, I mean both queen don't they at the same time, but they don't because black queen's a with check, and I think even if white queen first, there's a skewer, isn't there? Okay, so in the game, Rook B7 check, King A4. Rook G7, check. Pawn got pushed, check. A few sort of checks, just trying to get a few more moves on the score sheet maybe. And I'm not sure what they sort of played on from here, but yeah, there must be a resignation coming soon, and there it was. There was the resignation. But going back to this position, this is still drawn. And rather than thinking, right, I'll swap the G pawn for the H pawn and then play King D4, white should just play King D4. The white king's getting in, and there's nothing that black can do that's useful over here. Basically, it's just going to be a pawn swap, or if the king comes over, we're easily going to be able to nab the A pawn and get defended against that G pawn. In rook and pawn versus rook. Yeah, I mean, if black tries to stop the white king coming in, rook takes G7 then. And, I mean, black's still got to deal with this rather than checking you off the D file. So we're going to get a check over here, and it's going to be a draw. It is a draw. Like I said earlier, I mean, there's 2 pages of analysis in the Dvoretsky Endgame Manual on that. I very much doubt I've done it all justice, but hopefully we've covered enough there that might, well, it's useful for me, so hopefully it's useful for someone else as well. I'm afraid it doesn't get any easier. So this is a game from 1977. You could pause the video and study this for an hour if you wanted to. It is black to play, and the question is, can black save this? Is there anything at all that black can do to save this? Any ideas? I mean, I had a game last Thursday at the Rolls-Royce Club in Derby, and I got to a completely lost position and just sat there at the end for 5 minutes or so, maybe as many as 8 minutes, just looking at the final position, thinking, is there anything I've got here that can, even just a sneaky try, something? And then no. It's like, oh, so I just resigned. But I wouldn't resign this. I think there are things we can try. What should black do? So, pushing the G pawn, just to sort of see how much of a dreadful situation black's in. G3, B7, rook F8, rook B2. You're dead. You could resign that. Okay. So black's in big trouble. In the game, rook A8 check. Good move. Shove the king to the B file. Okay. And then push the G pawn. You want the white king on the B file to try. It's sneaky tricks, basically. But they're quite strong sneaky tricks. Sneaky checks. Sneaky tricks. The engine's saying checkmate in 30. Okay. Again, to that hypothetical person who's saying, oh, I was winning, the engine said this. It's like, it doesn't matter. It really... I don't know, I'm getting angry with this hypothetical person. Okay, that's not how chess works. B7 played in the game. Okay. Rook F8. Now, incredibly, white's only got one winning move. Okay. Yeah, sure, it's checkmate in 37. Can you not see? This is checkmate in 37. The engine, the oracle, says yes, you are winning. But there's only one winning move in this position. What is it? Because it doesn't jump off the screen at me. And I don't know if I'd find it. I think if I did find it, it would be by luck more than anything else. In the game, rook C2 was played. Okay. And it's now gone. The wind's gone. And here's black's clever drawing idea. Rook F2. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, because if we swap rooks, then we've got a bishop's pawn against a queen, and that's just a draw. So yeah, absolutely brilliant. And if we queen, incredibly black's going to have a fortress there. There's just nothing that white can do to penetrate that. So if we go back to that position where there was only one winning move, if I can find it, which is here. Your only one winning move as white, if you want the checkmate in 37, is rook A2. So what's so good about that? Black's got the same thing, rook F2. This time we can go rook A4. You think, what's so good about that? You could have played rook C4 in that other variation. Why rook A4? You want your rook on the A file, because in this position, I mean, obviously, if black just sort of nabs the G pawn and tries to promote their G pawn, it's completely hopeless. White's going to get a queen and win. So you have to play rook F8 to come back and stop white queening. King into C6. Black king takes on G2. Black's like, whatever, I'm just going to take this pawn with my rook. You know, and then I've got a drawn version of rook versus pawn. Well, not with our rook on the A file, you haven't. Oh, yeah, oh. So what's black got now? It's either queen versus a knight's pawn, which is absolutely not a draw, that's a win for white, or what? So, well, we'll just check the white king. We'll check the white king down the board, because our king's controlling these squares, so that'll be a bunch of decent checks. And white's like, I'll come down the board. I'll come down the board. Okay. Once we get down to this bit of the board, obviously the white king could come back up to a square like e4, and it's going to be, once the white king comes across, the black rook can go behind the B pawn. That could have been done earlier, by the way. Okay, so the reason the white king's coming down on the C file is because the rook can just earmark itself for the taking of that pawn, and you are again going to get a drawn version of rook versus pawn. So white comes down the board and then comes in on the black rook, and just needs to make its way to e4, because the point is that white king is now close enough to the G pawn that you're not going to get a drawn version of king versus rook. You're going to get rook versus pawn. Sorry, you're going to get a one version of it. So that's just gone. Everyone see that back here, right? Rook A2, only winning move. Right, where were we? I've got to remind myself where we were now. So G3 is just useless. White just wins. Rook A8 check played in the game. Force the king to the B file. So after G3, White's got tricks sorry, black's got tricks. So b7 played in the game, and then black started with those tricks. Rook f8, and now white's only got one winning move, which does win, rook a2. However, after g3, white's got maybe a stronger move than pushing the b pawn straight away, which is to get the rook sort of multitasking temporarily. This frees up the white king. Okay, well, because the white rook is behind the b pawn, but simultaneously, again, it has to be done in green and red. Simultaneously, sort of temporarily stopping the taking of the g pawn. Black's got a problem. So let's say black tries similar sort of tricks. Rook f8, king to c4. What's the idea behind king c4? That when black plays rook f2, we can go king c3. If the rooks are swapped there, we're going to get a one version of queen versus pawn because it's a knight's pawn, not a bishop's pawn. So what does black do? Can't swap the rook. If we go back to f7, b pawn pushed, takes, we see a take, and that's a one version of rook versus pawn. Alright, I'll go back to f8. What do you got to say about that? B pawn gets pushed, rook to b8, king d4, black just waits, king g1. We're in that sort of dilemma again, where the white king's in a sort of no man's land. King d5 is still going to be a one version of rook versus pawn if black takes the b pawn. So black just waits with king h2, but now we can make contact with the b pawn, so the rook can no longer take it. Black tries this trick again, rook f8, and it's still complete. This is just one for white here, but I mean king d6 is probably the strongest move, putting black in a kind of zugzwang. But white's got to be careful again. King c7, rook f7 check. You've only got two winning moves now, and for example, well, you can't come off the defense of the b pawn because you are going to end up in a drawn version of rook versus pawn. Black will just nab the b pawn and they'll just swap it. You know, we'll swap his rook for the b and the g pawn. Very similar to that time on of Haverbacker game, we saw the previous game basically. And king b6, I mean, that maintains contact, but that's now a draw. Like, why is that a draw? I don't have to take that with the rook. It's like, well, black's got this. It's like, excuse me. That's like, wow. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And white's like, well, whatever. I'll just drop my rook back. I'm still getting a queen. You haven't got time. And black's just comes back. We're now threatening to take on g2. There's no way for white to defend that pawn except to come back to b2. Absolutely brilliant. Although in this position, king c6 and repeat, and try king d6 in a minute, I suppose. Back in, which position was it? Yeah. So it was tough. It was tough to win, despite them and the fact that this is a white to play, checkmate in 20, and after this move, white to play is checkmate in 23. Engine says I was completely winning. It's like, yeah, maybe, but king b6, which is a perfectly sensible move, throws away the win to this thunderbolt. Right, last but not least, this is a game from 1983. I'm sorry to say that it's just as complicated as the other two. So this sort of rook and 2 versus rook and 1, where you've got a passed pawn, there's just so much going on. The sort of which way's my king going, and the rook versus pawn. That last position we had queen versus pawn coming in because it was a bishop's pawn. And I think we've got both going on here as well. So same question as the last position. By the way, the answer to that last position was, can black save this? The answer is no. White's won. But we saw lots of little tricks in there where black did save it. And there were ideas, you know. One idea was to turn this into a bishop's pawn and have queen versus bishop's pawn. I think the main line, sorry, just to come back and do a conclusion. That fortress there, as a drawing idea. So, well, I could get that. Absolutely amazing that is a fortress, but it is. I mean, obviously we're going to win the G pawn, and yeah, there's just no way that White's going to make any progress after that. Yeah, so sorry, I interrupted myself there. I suppose you can always forward one the video if you're like, what's he doing now? Get on with it. This is a game from 1983. It is black to play. It is also very hard, and it's the same question as the last position, which is, can black save this position? Because it's not looking good. So the answer is that black can save this position, but my word, is it hard? Yeah, I mean, Yusupov was white in this game from back in 1983. And yeah, whilst black can save this position, good luck, basically. It's very hard to find the moves to save this position, and ultimately black didn't save this position. So the starting move, rook f8, and we're going to sort of see a similar idea to I mean, white's got this, and unless you do something about, something fast, then you're in trouble. And Yusupov played this move, king c2. And that's an extremely good move straight away, because if white comes in rook f4, the win is fairly elementary. Okay, we might see. I mean, the king had to go to the e file, by the way, not the g file. Otherwise, that would have been a check. But now, that's one. Okay, so this king c2 move and rook f4 sorry, can't be played. So in the game, black played king g3, and white was like, right, I'll get on with it. I'll push the a pawn. And in the game, rook f4 was now played, but it's still just lost. And it's fairly trivially lost, to be honest. Takes, g5. By the way, in that original position where black's played king g3, they've just cleared the way for their f pawn. So that king is now going to stay on g3. There was nowhere else it could have gone, particularly. So yeah, we see a pawn race. Black queen's first, sure, but white queens with check. And I mean, in the game, there's nothing that black can do to avoid a queen swap here. In the game, king h4 was played. You could pause the video here and work out what are you going to play here as white to force the queen swap. And it's quite clever. Queen d8 check. The black king doesn't have a square. This king is controlling two pretty important squares. Any king move to the third rank, that swaps the queens, and any king move to this diagonal, that swaps the queens. And that's it. Those are the only legal king moves. So that's how the game ended. It's like, hang on, so rook f8, fine. King c2, I can't play rook f4, alright, king g3. But now white's pushing their a pawn. I still can't play rook f4. What do I do? After the game, the player with the black pieces claimed that he would have drawn it very easily if he played rook a8. Okay, and started a frontal attack. So it doesn't look very good, does it? And to be honest, it's not great. Although it is still drawn, this position, incredibly. King b3, black just waits, rook d4. I mean, notice the thing I talked about in the last video with the sort of the lateral defense of the rook. The seat on the two pawns. That's usually pretty good stuff. Black just waits, king b4, and then the frontal attack. I suppose similar to the when you've got a vertical cutoff in rook and pawn versus rook. If the pawn is far enough back, then the frontal checks with the rook is the correct defensive technique. And we get into all that Grigoriev's combined method and stuff. So it's a similar kind of idea. King c5, rook back to a8, king b6, check. King to c6 to avoid getting cut off on the a file. Rook back to a8, king b7. Yeah, and the player with the black piece. So this is still drawn, by the way, but the player with the black piece has said, yeah, now I'll play rook a5. But this is just not a draw. Okay, it's just definitely not a draw. We see the checks again. Rook back to a8. Rook a4, and then black can just go for it here. This is not a drawn version of rook versus pawn. I mean, white has loads of winning moves, but the simplest one for me would just be count out the number of moves to the crossroad, the crucial crossroads position. Time gaining check. Pretty sure that was crucial. It absolutely was crucial. White to play as a win, black to play as a draw. It is white to play, so it is a win. So yeah, quick reminder of how we got there. Rook f8, king c2 played in the game. Rook f4 not played correctly. King g3, push the a pawn, play with the black pieces after the game claimed that this would work, but we've just seen that it doesn't work. Okay. Although it does, this is still drawn if after king b7, black now switches to the other defensive idea. Okay, rook f8, a pawn pushed, rook f4, rooks get swapped, we see a pawn race, queening, mutual queening, and that's a drawn version. Okay, this pawn doesn't look like it's going to last for long, to be honest. I think even I'd be comfortable having a go at drawing that. Yeah, I think I could draw that. I think that's all right. So that rook f8 move is a saving move. All of this, though, is, I guess, a little bit of a moot point, because in this position, after the pushing of the a-pawn, two other grandmasters, I love the way they all sort of analyse each other's games and look at, like, oh, what if they played this? Then on move 6, this could have happened. By the way, something that I've sort of been meaning to say for a while is, you know, I'm reading this book, which I find amazing, and the more I get into it, the more I enjoy it, the harder I find it. It is just so hard. And it sort of amused me that I was reading, I can't remember where it was in the book, but it was like 7 moves into a particular variation, and Dvoretsky's, he writes something along the lines of, like, well, I remember once I had a chat with Smyslov as to whether 7 rook f7 it would be an improvement on that line. And it just sort of, it made me realise why these guys are all grandmasters and, you know, we're not. Because it's like, who does that? We play our games, we chuck them in an engine, go, oh, I should have done that. Engine says I was winning, as discussed, and then sort of bin them, learn nothing, and carry on as we were before. Whereas these guys, they sort of look at each other's games, go away and ponder them, and then get together and go, oh, I've had an idea for something that could happen on move 7 of this end game played by someone else. It just made me chuckle. Anyway, where was I? So with this, so a4. Yeah. So what does black do here? So it was 2 other grandmasters who saw this position and saw the losing move in the game, rook f4, and listened to what the player with the black pieces said about that rook a8 and how it didn't work, but actually later on, if you switched plans to that rook f8 move, etc., etc. But then they sort of said, well, what about this as a drawing plan instead? Rook f2 check. And what you're trying to do here is similar to that first game, where we had all those checks going on. You're trying to drive the attacking king into a sort of unfavourable place. And when that unfavourable place is reached, then you go for the drawn version of rook versus pawn. So king c3, rook f3 check. Which way's the white king going to go? Basically back onto the second rank, b2 or d2. So if to b2, then we can go rook f4, because the white king is in an unfavourable place. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to force the white king to an unfavourable place and then play your rook f4 idea. We'd see the pawn race again, check. King h4. That one I'm not as confident on, but apparently that is a draw. Okay, good luck drawing that against Stockfish, but I guess, yeah, one Grandmaster could draw that against another, hopefully. There's no way for white to force the queen swap. And isn't the black king wanted down here, I think, isn't it? It's like, because this pawn's going that way. So the black king's quite close to the area of the board it needs to be in. That's kind of all I know about this position at the moment. I'm going to get onto queen endings at some point. So that's if the white king goes away from the rook. It goes to an unfavourable place. If it comes towards the rook, so that you can't play that rook f4, you just keep checking. King d1, and then you come behind the a pawn. If the white king comes over, you go back to f2. So you're either going to get a pendulum. The thing is that this rook's doing a brilliant lateral defence of both these pawns. So any push of this, we're going to see rook behind the a pawn, and either the a pawn or the g pawn is going to fall. And that's just going to be a draw. If the white king comes back, you're going to get some sort of pendulum. And if the white king goes to guard the a4 square, once again, the white king is too far away. So rook f4 would have been the brilliant drawing plan finished off. I think I've covered everything in that position. All three of those positions, I would be amazed if I've done full justice to the analysis. I've tried my very best. I'm not 100% convinced that I understand every single little nuance of all of those positions, but I've got a lot from it, and hope you guys have too.